Thankful that you all welcome me to worship with you this morning, to be with you, to celebrate in your community. So thank you so much for having me. And I want to begin with a story. I want to begin first with the story of a friend of mine named Lexi, who is a 32-year-old trans woman who's currently locked up in a jail in Boston. I spent basically all of my life in the Boston area until just recently moved to Chicago about a year ago. So this is a new home for me. But Lexi is somebody I've known for almost a decade. And she's a young trans woman who has had to navigate survival in a lot of different complicated ways. When she was 14 years old, her mom was struggling with heroin addiction and crack addiction and introduced Lexi to drugs to manage and to live in a world that was treating people who are poor, right, with disrespect, not giving people access to things that they need, and not creating healthy homes and communities. And so Lexi was introduced to heroin at a really young age and started using when she was 14. She's 32 years old now and has been using consistently that whole time. The way our system has responded to her has been to punish her for her addiction. When she was a teenager, she got caught up with police multiple times, getting picked up for petty theft, stealing things from CVS. And then around in that time when she was a late teenager, early 20s, she started coming out as transgender, as a young woman. She had been raised as a boy, was coming out into the world, telling her true self of who she was. At the same time, she's struggling with addiction and trying to get by. And for young trans women, and for anybody struggling with addiction, access to jobs is not the easiest thing to do. You still need to survive. In our capitalist society, without money, you're not going to get through. You're not going to make it. And so she needed to figure out ways to make money. So as a young woman, the easiest ways that she could figure out how to make money as a young trans woman was being excluded from all above ground economies, legal economies, was by trading sex. Right? And the first time she got picked up by the police to actually serve a sentence was for trading sex. Prostitution, right, as we call it. That she was, again, figuring out ways that she was going to get by in a society that had thrown her away. As a transgender person, as someone struggling with addiction, there were no resources or support really for her. Even in Massachusetts, where we claim that we have great health care, it's still incredibly difficult to get the resources that one needs to get through it. When figuring out how to deal with heroin addiction, there's a lot of getting up, falling down, getting up, falling down. Getting over addiction is an incredibly hard, often lifelong process. Maybe some of us know that personally or have loved ones who've known that personally. And we don't have a system designed to nurture people struggling. Rather, we punish them, punishing people for addiction rather than treating, loving, nurturing, bringing them in. And so I actually first met Lexi when she stole all the computers from my church. I was the minister at the church, and she was part of a youth program there. And she, one snowy night, came in, and as the story goes, as she tells it now, she picked up our really cheap, not worth stealing computers in her high heels and went back out the outside the back, what is that? The fire escape, excuse me. Out the fire escape, back out the doors and off to trade them for maybe $100, $150 in order to get her next fix, right? And then we met a few months later when a friend of hers wanted to have some communication about getting her support while she was going to court. Not for that, we weren't going to press charges. There's nothing useful about pressing charges against a young person who's stealing to survive. Even when a church loses the things that we care about, thinking long term about what would happen to her if we had called the police. What justice would have been brought, what justice could have been made possible. And so we didn't. We didn't call the police. But I met Lexi when she had another charge coming for her. And she needed somebody to go to court with her. Because when anybody goes to court, the first thing that court is boring. More than anything else. The first thing that court is boring. There's a lot of sitting and waiting more. As you watch people stand up in front of the judge and be judged by everybody in that room for how they're dressed, for what they're charged with, for what the district attorneys or your state's attorneys are saying about you. And then judged in that moment as you take a plea deal, most likely, and then go off to either serve a sentence, do probation, go home, whatever's happening next in your sentence. But for young trans women, or for trans women of all ages, one of the scary things that happens inside a courtroom is that you're often called by a name that is not a name you go by anymore. Called by a legal name that maybe you haven't been able to change for all sorts of different reasons. And then you have an attorney who may or may not be addressing you by the right pronouns. Someone who's supposed to be looking out for you, defending you, calling you sir, mister, in front of a judge who calls you mister. And so one of the first responsibilities that she was asking me to take on was to be clear with her attorney, be clear with the judge that, no, this is not okay. You need to recognize this trans woman for who she is. This is a dehumanizing space already as it is for everybody. You need to, at the very least, be addressing her by miss. At the very least, addressing her as who she is. Calling out in court, speaking truth about who she was, whatever we needed to do. And so that was the beginning of our relationship. But Lexi has struggled our whole time of knowing each other in and out of jail, trying hard to get clean sometimes, other times not. Her journey around her sobriety is hers. Her journey around her sobriety is for her to decide what she wants to do in terms of stopping using. My responsibility, and what I think is the responsibility of all communities, is to make sure people have all the resources possible to succeed, to survive. She right now is serving some more time for, this time, who knows, maybe stealing something, getting in a fight. It's a little unclear to me. But she's sitting inside a jail where the dehumanization continues, where she has been continuously strip searched by male guards. And this is a constant reality for transgender women inside the US prison system, that she fortunately is now addressed by the correct name. Even her prison ID now says female on it, and yet she still is being subjected to regular strip searches by male staff. This dehumanizing process of not recognizing who she is inside this system of violence, this is a constant reality for transgender people across the country. At one point, she refused a strip search by a male guard, and their response to her was to attack her with a whole group of male guards, to cut the clothes off of her body, to force her to be strip searched. This for the security of the institution. And so I tell you these stories not just to make you angry or sad or uncomfortable, or maybe even, I apologize, to trigger your own things coming up. I tell you these because this is what our system is. Often people talk about how we need to reform the US prison system, that we need to make it better, to address the harms that the system that we have is broken. We have more and more attention coming to the US prison system. President Obama visited a federal prison while he was in office, the first time a president has ever done so. People started paying a lot of attention when Michelle Alexander's book, New Jim Crow, became popular. Has anyone read that book or seen that book? A couple folks. Michelle Alexander, an amazing writer, author, professor, who has given an introduction, especially to white folks, that the US prison system functions as a new way of operating our country operating a Jim Crow system of targeting, rounding up, incarcerating black men. That was her focus in her book. That criminal is just a coded way of talking about black men, this term. And all of these things I think are really important for us to think about, except one of the things that I would say is not that our system is broken, but that it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. That the US criminal legal system has been designed since its beginning, rooted in a theology of punishment, punitive ways of treating human beings, has always been about putting those that society considers disposable, undesirable, into cages. That we know now, in 2018, that the majority of people who cause harm, physically assault somebody, sexually assault somebody, and actually even murder people, the majority of folks who cause this harm are not in prison, are not in jail, are not serving time. Many of them are CEOs destroying our planet. Many of them are cops who get away with killing young black people all the time. Many of them are part of our military who are celebrated when they kill people. That the harming of other people does not necessarily turn into incarceration. Stealing things, as we see with gentrification and the stealing of resources from communities of color by white folks, is celebrated as advancing a community. That this theft is never disciplined or punished, it's honored. And so when we look at this system, for me and many others who are part of the new or growing or continued abolitionist movement, are suggesting not that we need to reform the system, but that we need to abolish the system. That police who stem from slave capturing patrols of going after folks who are escaping from chattel slavery, that our original police officers were the bringing together of these slave patrols, but there's nothing to reform about that. We need to create something different. Or that prisons, which we've been using to cage people really since the 1700s, 1600s maybe, 1700s in the US. I've been using them first to cage Irish immigrants, Catholics at the beginning of the system, because we weren't incarcerating black men at that point or black women at that point because of chattel slavery. We allowed that punishment to be done almost exclusively by plantation owners. So when we see the end of chattel slavery, we begin to see the incarceration of black people at overwhelming levels. And at the end of the civil rights movement, that's when we see the biggest boom in the prison system that we have today. We see what people now call mass incarceration beginning. We have 2.3 million people inside US prisons, 1% of our population. 5 million more on probation and parole. We have this system of control that is so large, and so big, and taking up so much of our lives. And so much of it, I believe, is rooted in a harmful Protestant Christian theology of punishment. That there is something salvific about punishing people. That because Jesus was crucified for our sins, we got saved through that. That dangerous theology, I think, the substitutionary theology that God had to punish somebody for others of us to be saved, translates to our US criminal legal system. This idea that by punishing someone, they get closer to God. That's the idea of these early prisons. They were called penitentiaries because you're supposed to do your penance inside of them. To be silent in solitary confinement cells, which now we understand to be torture, with a Bible that most people couldn't read anyway, because they weren't literate. That you were supposed to sit there, pay your penance, And that would right your relationship with God. And then, after being punished, you come back into the community. No one asked what you needed, what food you might need, what housing you might need, what resources you might need to survive. It's about punishing the person to save them. And this punishment-based theology continues as we think about who are, as was said, the bad people that we lock up. The truth is, we lock up so many people. It's not about bad people. It's about who has access to resources. It's about locking up those who are poor, black, brown, people with mental illness. That we see those who are oppressed in our society being the ones who are locked up. And so my question about how abolition becomes a Christian practice is about transforming the theology. As a universalist, my ancestors, religious ancestors, believed that there was nothing salvific about punishment, that after death there was no possibility or potential for hell, that all people were saved and going to heaven. And so if that theology applies after death, why not apply it during life too? That there is nothing salvific about punishment. That the crucifixion of Jesus was not done for God, it was done by an empire. It was done by Rome. It was done because Jesus was a radical, a revolutionary, challenging the status quo. The crucifixion is not about, that is not what saves us. God's love and the power of love is what is salvific, not punishment. Loving each other into our fullness brings us closer to God. Holding on to that idea of mercy. Mercy for ourselves, mercy as we interact with others. As Michael is calling on us to love mercy, not to love punishment, not to love harming one another, but to figure out ways that we can move beyond punishing theologies and move into loving, caring, transforming theologies. That the resurrection, for me, is about the resurrection of community, not the living body of Jesus who was crucified, the resurrection of a theology of transformation. And to live into that resurrection, to live into that Christ story, is about living into the possibility of change. I think for Lexi, that change is about, hopefully, one day, getting over her addiction, dealing with that. But really for the community, the transformation of the community that allowed this to happen in the first place. The community that wasn't there when she was introduced to drugs. The community that wasn't there to provide her the resources she needed so she could have housing, somewhere to stay, food to eat, clothes for her body, gender-affirming care. Have all of these resources. We are the ones who truly need resurrection. A resurrection of community into the power of what is beautiful and holy, caring. Abolition is not only about getting rid of the concrete, steel prisons and jails that are locking people up. It is a creative process of making sure we have all of the things that we need to survive. Making sure that people have the resources to get through. Your mission talks about social justice. That ensuring that justice is done for all of us is ensuring that we have what we need to survive and to thrive. So I invite all of us into this work of abolition. To try on these ideas of not calling the police. Try on the ideas of holding each other accountable when harm happens, but holding each other accountable with love. Recognizing each other's full humanity. Recognizing the times when we have caused harm. Figuring out how it is that we can transform and be sure that communities have what they need to get by. So let us let go of punishment as a practice punish ourselves. Don't punish each other. Get away from punishment as a practice. And open ourselves up to what it means to roll back a tomb, to be transformed in a society rooted in love. That is what I ask us to try on, to move forward this week and moving into our days as we imagine what it could be, the possibilities of abolition, and a new transformative theology. Amen.
Amen.